Things Hidden. And welcome back to Things Hidden. This is our podcast where we do a deep dive, where we use the principles that I ground my work in to understand, where we have come from in anthropology. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and we're going to have another exciting discussion today. And we're going to pick up where we left off, where we're going to get into how the early church, how early Christians saw the significance of the Passion of Christ, how that significance, the way they depicted it in some of the earliest portrayals of what Jesus did in his crucifixion and resurrection and that whole Passion story, we're going to see how that impacted their worldview away from sacrifice, away from collective violence, away from scapegoating. And remember, my running premise is that scapegoating is at the heart of politics today. That's one of the premises of this, podcast. But it's something that it's very important for us to understand that the church intuitively felt, the early Christian followers who were moved and transformed by hearing the story of Jesus' persecution and resurrection. They were moved in a particular direction that led them to reject the sacrificial order of collective violence that ruled the world, that ruled the broader Roman community that they were a part of at the time. Remember, the word pharmakos means, drug. It's where we get pharmacy from today. And that was the antidote to chaos. Whenever there was a problem, whenever there was a calamity, whenever there was a plague, whenever there was social stress, someone needs to be impeached. Somebody needs to be excommunicated. Somebody needs to take the hit. Somebody needs to take their skin and be, open their skin up as a sacrifice for the community. And that might makes right logic is what the Christian community rejects when they encounter the story of Jesus. Now, obviously, this is not something that's a 0 to 1 moment in the sense that, everyone just starts acting perfect once they hear the story of Jesus. No, but we need to understand how radical and what specifically they took away from the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So to do that, I'm going to borrow from a passage by S. Mark Heim again. He's a theologian that I enjoy and I've talked to, and he's got a great book called Saved from Sacrifice, A Theology of the Cross, which dovetails with the work of René Girard that we pull from as well. And he is talking about a piece of one of the earliest Christian artistic representations of the Passion. It's called the Brescia Casket. And this dates, he says, from some 3.5 centuries after Christ. The casket and its images have been the subject of a lot of scholarship that is fascinating. The top of the casket has 5 large panels, he says, clearly the thematic focus of the work. And these include scenes from the Passion narrative, Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, the arrest of Christ, the denial of Peter, Christ before the high priest, Christ before Pilate. And notice there's no crucifixion depicted in any of these panels on this early Christian casket of an early follower of Jesus. And that doesn't mean it's not important, but it just gives you an indication of what they're focusing. What are the main artistic representations they're taking away from the story? But what's also interesting is the other characters that are depicted on this Brescia casket, this earliest known representation of Jesus' passion. And they include some interesting characters. They include the character Jonah from the book of Jonah in the Old Testament. They include Daniel, the prophet Daniel, the famous lion's den story. And then they have Susanna. Susanna is a character in the Old Testament. Now, what's interesting about these 3 stories is that each of these stories in their own unique way represents someone who is a victim of collective violence, but in the end triumphs. So that gives us a clue that the way they represent the story of Jesus in connection to these other stories as kind of symbolic, artistic, verifications or types of the true story of Jesus, the full story of Jesus, these types give us a clue as to what really transformed the worldview of the Christians. So let's go through these stories briefly, just to give you an indication of how radical the break from the world they had known, both the Jewish Christians and the Gentile convert Christians, given the sacrificial logic of might makes right that plagued both communities in the presence of Jesus' coming into the story of history. So Jonah is classically, remember that Jesus, when they ask him, what's the sign of your, you're going to be in the, what's your sign that you're Messiah? He says, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. Now that's interesting, right? There's the 3 days in the belly of the well that Jonah goes through, and then there's the 3 days in the belly of the earth that Jesus goes through. So that's an obvious connection. But what's interesting there is that people often miss is that during the, Jonah is told to go to this wicked, pagan community of Nineveh and tell them they need to just turn from their ways and that God's mercy will abound with them. And Jonah thinks they're not worth it. They're a bunch of, wicked, evil, mean, fascists or communists or whatever word you want to call it to make it home for our today's thoughts, right? They're a bunch of awful people, not deserving of mercy and love. So I don't want to tell him that story. So he gets on a boat and he travels out, and a massive storm comes. And the sailors immediately have a crisis, just like a mimetic crisis or a war of all against all. Remember that word accuser? That Satan is the word, Satan means accuser. So they all start accusing each other. It's your fault. Now, who's the guilty person for why this storm is tearing us apart? Because, see, they're based in their worldview on the idea that if bad things happen, if there's tensions, some God is mad at somebody, we need to shed blood for the gods to give us blessing again. So they have a microcosm of the same sacrificial order that Jesus is upending in history. But here, this Jonah story is an early, artistic representation of what Jesus is going to do later in history. So they're all blaming each other for the tumultuous storm, just like in ancient communities when there was a plague or a famine or bad blood or a lot of contagious accusations throwing around. They would eventually land on a common enemy to unite the community in killing or excommunicating. Well, in this case, Jonah is a willing person. He's willing to take the hit because he kind of shares their suspicion that God is against him. So he says, you guys can, throw me over and kill me, and that will work. And so they do it, and it says they were convinced that was exactly what was needed to calm the storm. And then it's interesting there because in that ancient text, you see a depiction of anthropology. This is thousands and thousands of years before our science has even begun to scratch the surface, because it says afterwards that the sailors started doing sacrifice and sacrificial rituals as in thanksgiving to the gods or whoever. I guess they think it's Jonah's God that's angered, and so they start doing sacrifices, kind of like in commemoration of the scapegoat killing that they just did. So they think that's what makes God happy. But the twist here, right, because this is what the Bible does, it always unveils and demystifies myth, is God isn't angry at Jonah. He doesn't want to destroy him. In fact, there's this story of a fish swallowing him, and then he goes through this almost like a death-like experience where it says his soul is in the realm of Sheol, and that he has this kind of his soul expires, or there's a word there that's kind of interesting to imply perhaps he had a kind of a near death or death-like experience, and then he vomits, the fish vomits up his corpse, and now he has a new life where he's going to go and follow the mission of offering a message of mercy and love to the people of Nineveh. And so he does that, and the text says Jonah's upset because all the Nineveh folks, they take the message of God's love and they change their ways and they stop their ugly practices. And there's a big revival of beauty and love in that community. And Jonah, it says, is angry about it, right? He's mad because he wanted to keep he's still clinging to that old sacrificial order of somebody needs to take the hit, somebody needs to be the bad guy, remember, this is just like the Gerasenes, the demoniac in the Gerasene community, right, in Jesus' day, when they go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee to engage with this Gentile community called the Gerasenes, and he, heals the demoniac man who's called Legion, and then it says the community was terrified at that because they had lost their scapegoat, they'd lost their whipping person, they'd lost their measuring rod about how great they were as a unified collective in contrast to their scapegoat. And so they're terrified, just like as Jonah was upset and angry when Nineveh hears the love of God and starts to move away from its violent behavior. So that is what early Christians put on a casket in representation of what Jesus did in his death and resurrection. So this is very important because it shows us that they got the picture powerfully, that this was a story about moving away from sacrifice, that someone, we think he's going to be sent off to be sacrificed by the community, but no, actually God did not want him to be sacrificed to avert the storm on the ship. He actually rescues him from death, or rescues him out of Sheol, or the place of death, which again is the place of all scapegoats in history. All scapegoats are covered up by piles of rocks if they're stoned or, thrown off of a cliff. They're always cast into, the belly of the earth, so to speak, covered up by mythology. So you can think of mythology as a kind of textual representation of the very act of covering up a dead body that you've blamed for all the problems. The text covers up the injustice of the killing of the scapegoat. It wasn't that the storm happened and therefore, because, this was a sacrificial crisis and God was mad at Jonah and therefore was happy that they murdered him by throwing him over the boat in the storm. It's actually that he was on the side of mercy. It's so much so that even Jonah still misses it when he goes and does the work of not scapegoating his enemy others. The pagans of the Nineveh community, he still doesn't fully get it. And that's kind of a clue to us that we still don't get it. Even those of us who want to spread the story of Jesus, we still get caught up in our stubborn desire for, there's bad guys. It's those lefties or those right-wingers or those Muslims or those, people in government, or there's always an other that just has to be totally the locus of all evil in our minds. It's a common habit we all have. And it's something that even those who obviously have been encountering the story of Jesus and trying to imitate him wrestle to shake that bad habit. And that's what we see there in Jonah. It's a very realistic story of what happens with Jesus because the sign of Jonah is fulfilled. Because what happens? His own community of Jesus kills Jesus because they think he's against God, just like the people on the ship think Jonah has displeased his God. But that killing actually ends up transforming the situation so that Jonah then shares the love of God to the broader pagan world and the Nineveh community, and it leads them to see the love of God. And that's a powerful thing that happens with Jesus' own story because his community kills him. They throw him over the board into the belly of the whale, so to speak, in the belly of pain and suffering and chaos. And he comes out of that. And that story of coming out of that death and that blame for other people's sins is the story that radically brings the love of God that Jesus was trying to show, and that was shown in the Jewish prophets and the other stories in the Old Testament. That story of God's love and his need for no collective violence to love people, and his rejection of scapegoating and his rejection of sacrificial logic and might makes right. That whole thing is given to the broader community because the Roman community within a few hundred years is totally transformed. Now, do they fully get it and fully adopt the full ethical, model of Jesus? No, obviously, again, humans fail to live up to this standard, and that's no excuse because we all need to really study how to imitate Jesus to take this story seriously. But nevertheless, the Romans in the time of Jesus, or shortly after the time of Jesus, represent like the Nineveh people of the broader world transforming towards the love of God. And that's the sign of Jonah that Jesus says. You'll know that I'm the Messiah because the broader world, the Nineveh, so to speak, the broader pagan world will finally get the love of God in the way it truly needs to be seen. And his own community, he tells them that, to see this, and they still don't see it in that story in the Gospels. And then you have the story of Susanna, which again is a radical anti-scapegoating story that the early Christians in this casket, this early art depicting their worldview of what they interpreted the power and transformative event of Jesus' death and resurrection. They use Susanna as another model. Susanna is a story from the Old Testament and the apocryphal texts where she is a beautiful woman who is accused. Two elder men in the community are lustful for her. They try to entrap her and accuse her of having adultery. She's a married woman, and they accuse her of having adultery with a younger man. And they use it as like leverage, saying, have sex with us, or we're going to accuse you of the very thing we desire. So they're going to project their sins onto her like a scapegoat, and they're going to tell the whole community that she was sleeping with somebody else. And she says, I'm not going to willingly have sex with you. So you got to do what you got to do. If you're not going to, you're going to have to, I'm not going to, do this willingly. And so the men, accost her, but then they present her to the community to create a collective scapegoating mob, to say this woman, and they falsely accuse her of being an adulterer. And the community is about to have a scapegoat mechanism start to unveil itself, a unanimous collective act of violence. But then Daniel, the wise judge, says, with that Holy Spirit fervor, which is, again, remember the word Holy Spirit means defender, like a defense attorney. So he's filled with that defense attorney spirit from God. And the text says that he says, I'm not going to let this innocent woman's blood be shed on my account. And so he then uses the trial as a way to disprove the false allegations against the men who were trying to lead a scapegoat lynching of the woman. And so she's vindicated at the end of the story. This is someone who was about to be murdered by the collective. Now she's proven to be innocent, and the people who stirred up the attempt to kill her were guilty of the things they accused her of. Again, this is another picture that's on this early casket, which is representative of the way the early Christian community understood the power of Jesus' death and resurrection. And then, of course, Daniel was also on that story, and that's a story we know more familiar with, where, Daniel refuses to go by the pagan sacrificial ways of the king that he is under the domain of, and he's thrown into the pit of being torn up by animals, and he doesn't die. So again, the vindication of a falsely accused person is the tie that the early Christians make to what's so powerful and what's so special about Jesus's passion, right? So this is so important for us to understand what was so powerful with Jesus' death and resurrection. And we miss that today. Today, when we think about, looking at the story of Susanna, we just automatically say, well, yeah, she's falsely accused. But think about it from that time's perspective. They did not have the story of a woman who's, getting the victim's perspective. This is a radical, if you want to use the word progressive, extreme, this is beyond that. This is super, super, super beyond the idea of progressive, because it's vindicating a woman who is in a position of very little power in that community. She's on the lower end of the hierarchy against a man's accusation of her being something, bad. And then the same story with Jonah, he's being, the ship sailors think that the God of Jonah hates him, and so they sacrifice him to him, but God stops him from being sacrificed. He brings him back, and Jonah, shows an anti-sacrifice message, anti-scapegoating message to the people of Nineveh, and then they're brought into mercy and a transformation of their community. So this is how we should think about the impact that the early Christians experienced with the story of Jonah. It's a powerful story, and it gives us a clue just by looking at this early piece of Christian art, how this story was so subversive to mythology. So in the next episode, I'm going to get into another event that happens shortly thereafter in the time of Jesus that deals with someone who is popular on the internet, Apollonius of Tyana, who is a pagan sorcerer and miracle worker who is often compared with Jesus by moderns as an example that Jesus was just a ripoff of. But we're going to see how this Apollonius, this pagan miracle worker, what makes him different and what makes the story of his miracles different in contrast to the story of Jesus, and how those differences and those contrasts will show us even more how the story of Jesus is against collective violence, and how, if that's the case, then we who want to imitate the role model of Jesus, whether we understand all the religious stuff or are into that or not, secular or Christian alike, if we want to imitate Jesus as a role model, we too have to reject the lie and the myth of collective violence in our own time. So we'll see you next time, and we'll be talking about Apollonius of Tyana on Things Hidden. I'm David Gornoski. You can email me, david@neighborschoice.com, if you have a comment or question. Godspeed.